Welcome to this video that I call United 232, the Sioux City miracle that would have been an O'Hare disaster. In the course of this video that's intended for air traffic controllers and frankly for FAA management, perhaps even senior FAA management all the way up to the administrator level, in an extreme situation, the principles I'm going to talk about in this particular video could conceivably even go up to the level of the Secretary of Transportation or even the U.S. President. What I want to talk about is some things to think about so that we can prevent an aviation disaster from occurring in certain kinds of emergency situations. To do that, I want to start by thinking about United 232. For those who are not familiar with United 232, hopefully this will jog your memory. United 232 was a 1989 flight in a DC-10 from Denver to O'Hare. By the way, that was the old Stapleton Airport, not the newer Denver International Airport. Of the 296 passengers and crew on the board, 112 died, 184 survived. Many people have seen the dramatic video as the airplane landed and kind of cartwheeled through a cornfield and turned into a fireball as it landed. I am not going to deal with the backstory on this airplane on this flight in any meaningful way. The backstory does involve the number 2 engine having an uncontained engine failure, which sent pieces of engine flying out of the engine casing and as shrapnel, causing leaks in all 3 hydraulic systems. That led to, first of all, physical damage to the airplane. Number 2, an inability to manipulate the flight controls in any meaningful way. And so the pilots had to very quickly ad-lib how to use differential power with the number 1 and number 3 engines kind of together for pitch or kind of opposite one another for yaw, which induces roll, to try to steer the airplane for a successful landing into Sioux City, Iowa, which is where they diverted to. What I want to note, though, for our purposes as we get started, begins with this paragraph that's right here. I won't highlight it as I read it. Oops, not the second one there. Landing was originally planned on the 9,000-foot runway 31. Difficulties in controlling the aircraft made lining up almost impossible. While dumping some of the excess fuel, the plane executed a series of mostly right-hand turns because turning the airplane in this direction was easier, and they were trying to line up on runway 31. When they came out, they were instead lined up with the closed 6,800-foot runway 22 and had little capacity to maneuver to something else. Now note, the fire trucks had been placed on 22, expecting them to land on runway 31, and so all the vehicles had to be quickly moved out of the way. Runway 22 had been permanently closed a year earlier. So what was going on? Well, let's use Google Maps and let's zoom into the Sioux City area. The airport's just south of town over here by Sergeant Bluff. And runway 22 was closed in 1988 or thereabouts. And so it's been closed for more than 30 years. You can still kind of see the vestiges of it. It's this piece of pavement right here that's got some X's on it. And if we follow it across the cornfield, you can even see across the cornfield some lower areas where you can sort of make out where the runway used to be. The beginning of the runway, and I don't know exactly to the foot where it was, but I think the beginning of the runway was roughly where the FedEx ground building is currently located at the time Google Maps snapped this photo. Now, to understand this a little bit better, we're going to go to the NTSB's accident report for this flight. And again, I'm going to ignore basically the full backstory. I will note that they were on a vector for spacing to O'Hare on something like a 20 or a 30 heading, and were kind of just turning on course when they had the engine failure. They made a series of mostly right-hand turns, kind of one left-hand turn, another right 360, and then they came in on that closed runway 22. The airplane touched down on the threshold slightly to the left of the center line of runway 22 at time 1600. First ground contact was made by the right wingtip. That's never good when the wingtip is the first thing to land. Followed very briefly, just a split second later, by the right main landing gear. The airplane skidded to the right of the runway and rolled to an inverted position. It ignited, it cartwheeled, it came to rest after crossing runway 1735. Very briefly, that runway is right here. And so what they did was they touched down roughly where the FedEx ground building is. I'm going to put it right about in the parking lot. I'm not pretending that's exact to the foot. And I'll show you in a second. They did not go down the runway down here, to cross and stay aligned with the runway. They ended up kind of over here. Now the airplane broke in pieces. This is where the center fuselage ended up. So I'll show you that here just a little bit further on. I'm going to zoom in on that part of the report. So the right wingtip, and they do have runway 22 kind of lined up as if it's 27 here just to fit it on the page better. But the right wingtip actually landed on the threshold area of 22, and the right main landing gear touched down in the grass. So the bulk of the mass of the airplane was going down the runway momentarily, but they had caught that right wingtip at first, and you could see, you can sort of discern that there's a little bit of curvature here as it was, and it was shedding pieces. So the tail engine, the number 2 engine along with the tail pylon, ended up here. The number 1 engine here, the number 3 engine here just past runway 1735. The cockpit ended up just short of 1735, and the main bulk of the airplane upside down was in the cornfield over here. So if I go back to Google Maps, I can't really easily, well, I can sort of, do that to indicate some curvature, but that's kind of what they did. So don't take this as an exact measurement but from touchdown to where the center fuselage area ended up was roughly 4,000 feet with some curvature to the right. Now, I am thankful that they curved to the right. Imagine, for the sake of discussion, and I suppose this could have equally happened, that they instead had curved more towards the left. Can't be exact about this. I don't pretend to have this accurate to a foot, but they would have been into buildings and hangars and things like that. And that's what I want to note, is United 232, because they had trouble steering the airplane, we at some level got away with the fact that when they went off the runway, they went into a cornfield instead of an area with other stuff. Let's explore that concept a little bit more by thinking about my point about what would have happened if they had, for whatever reason, continued on to O'Hare. Maybe they had tried to continue on. Maybe they had been closer in when this failure had occurred. Again, there's any number of scenarios, but just for the sake of discussion, let's say they had elected to go on to O'Hare. So here's the O'Hare Airport. Obviously, the layout has changed over time. So for purposes of discussion, in particular because at some level what I'm talking about now is a bit of a hypothetical, I want you to think about what would have happened if they had tried to come into O'Hare with this sort of an airplane and were trying to work their way in and been halfway successful in what appears to me, just eyeballing it, to be the longest runway, which is 28 right. I think I have my runway numbers correct. Okay, if they had tried to do that, and if they had touched down at about the beginning of the runway and had kind of curved, okay, within just over 4,000 feet, you now have large pieces of the airplane ending up in the gate area for whatever, looks like this is hotel area, so Hotel 16, Hotel 17. And I know COVID has kept traffic counts down, and I can't vouch for what day this picture was taken by Google Maps. It says this imagery is from 2020, so it's probably COVID affected and traffic's down. But think about what you normally have. You normally have airplanes sitting here at the gate full of fuel. You have hundreds of people in the terminal area. As planes are boarding and deboarding, you've got hundreds of people sitting in these planes. At some level, if we were to have a plane like a United 232 with steering problems and we try to land on the longest runway and they do something akin to what United 232 did, we now have the worst aviation disaster ever as we in effect bring other people into the mix. I'm not kidding, and to understand that, I want to go back to United 232 for a second, and I want to note something that is not well known. This happened in 1989, and at some level, Captain Al Haynes and his crew got some inspiration from the successful emergency landing that you've likely never heard of from Delta Flight 1080. And Delta 1080 was important enough, it has its own Wikipedia page. Not that Wikipedia is precedent setting, but it gives you some sense of what happened here. Delta 1080 was a flight on an L-1011, outwardly similar to a DC-10, but this started as an utterly different kind of incident. This was 1977, so 12 years before Captain Al Haynes ended up in Sioux City. And there's, again, I'm not going to go into the backstory, but there was a failure, and there is no way the crew could have possibly known this. The left elevator became stuck in a fully upward position. And so as they were accelerating down the runway, because that left elevator was stuck in the full up position, and again, there is no way the crew could have known about this, the nose suddenly rotated much earlier than the pilots were expecting to rotate it themselves. The airplane launched into the air. It was quite a wild ride. I'm going to skip the discussion about that and so on. But what they did was they realized that they could use differential thrust, and it was a wild ride for a moment. Ultimately, they landed without incident, as it were, at Los Angeles, so they didn't cartwheel the airplane and so on. But you think, Los Angeles, okay, well, that's maybe a little bit hairy. Let's kind of go over to LA. And again, the airport, I'm sure has changed somewhat, as has the local environment since 1977. When Delta Flight 1080 was here. But think about the runway layout here. You have all kinds of stuff with terminals and residential areas and so on. I'd like to take you to Captain McMahon's own account of this flight. This is reproduced from the Airline Pilot magazine, July of 1978, so a little over a year after the flight occurred. And he was invited to write an article about this, and so it was written by Captain Jack McMahon himself from Delta Airlines. And he says, on April 12, 1977, I was the captain of Flight 1080, etc., etc. Again, I'm going to skip most of this for the sake of time, and because for the purposes of this discussion, I am not per se interested in the specifics of the particular incident. I do want to note one thing, though. It's expressed in two places here in the article. The first thing is this little section here. So ultimately, and I'm skipping a lot of backstory here, the decision to proceed to Los Angeles, even though the weather was marginal, was made primarily due to our rather limited options. Most importantly, we were stabilized. Again, that was a wild ride to kind of get it stabilized, but it was very difficult, but they did manage to get it stabilized in smooth air over the water with plenty of altitude to work with in the event we had further difficulties. And LAX offered our best chance for a long, straight-in, stabilized approach to runway 6 right. It's an approach I was very familiar with, a strong plus factor. We contacted LA Center, declared the emergency, requested about a 15-mile straight-in approach to 6 right. But he then goes on to discuss it a little bit more, and it's in this little section here. And I want to highlight this. So another consideration was the thrust drag curve during the approach. Just as they put the gear and flaps down, was that going to create a problem? Kind of skipping that, he says, my evaluation was that there was a strong possibility we might reach an altitude of 400 or 500 feet during the approach and then lose control. This reasoning was also a major consideration in selecting the west to east approach to runway 6 right at Los Angeles. I will note, and it's not in the highlighted part here, winds were out of the west, so this meant landing with a tailwind. That's often bad. Generally don't recommend it. Sometimes there are other factors, and I think this Captain McMahon was absolutely spot on right. And it's easy for me to sit here in my armchair and talk about this. I think he was absolutely right to accept that small tailwind so that he could come into 6 right. How come? Well, he says, we elected to remain over water to avoid endangering lives and property on the ground. Although landing east to west on runway 24 is a better approach, and it would have been into the wind in this particular day, it is over residential areas. I had a mental picture of what a holocaust this could create. I thought to myself, if we lose it over water. And by the way, this was a pretty hairy landing, but they managed to get it done. Good job, Captain McMahon and crew. Okay, so one issue is to keep in mind if an airplane is having some kind of steering difficulty because the left elevator is stuck up or there's been a total hydraulic failure from the engine explosion from number 2. And there can be other situations that lead to, in effect, steering difficulties of one kind or another. At that point, it becomes important for us to start to calculate and to think about people on the ground, okay, so try to avoid overflying residential areas. Give some thought to where the touchdown might take place such that they might swerve into an area where you have thousands of people sitting in planes parked with jet fuel, which leads me to one other consideration. I'll go back to LAX and just kind of use this here as an example. So some of you might think, okay, LAX, and suppose that they're looking at touching down maybe here or so, and they kind of swerve off to the right. And okay, well, that's a little farther than United 232. We probably get away with it. There's one other thing to keep in mind, and so I want to shift gears again. I want to look at Air Canada Flight 759. This happened recently enough, I would think most controllers, as of today when I'm filming this on October 28th of 2020, would have at least some passing familiarity with this, particularly because it's been noted in some of the recurrent training about wrong runway operations. July of 2017, Airbus 320 operating as Air Canada Flight 759 was nearly involved in an accident at San Francisco. Basically, if you look at the San Francisco airport, sorry, wrong window, let's go to Google Maps, let's go up here to San Francisco real quick. Okay, basically what happened was, and this was at night, 28 left was closed due to maintenance and NOTAMed out of service, so everything was on 28 right. It was an unusual configuration, and therefore you had planes taxiing for takeoff on whatever taxiway this is for our purposes. I don't need to find out what taxiway that is. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 airplanes that are lined up on this taxiway getting ready to depart as Air Canada 759 came in, and due to confusion, and there were multiple factors including fatigue, the problems with the NOTAM system, just pilot expectations of what they're doing, etc., they were cleared to land 28 right. But because this was closed, you had the runway lights off, and so in effect you had lights on for this runway and taxiway lights on. The pilot, for multiple reasons, should not have confused what they were lining up on. Having said that, and without defending them, they were human beings. They were cleared to land on 28 right, and they ended up lining up with taxiway, I want to say Charlie. So they came in lined up on this taxiway, and at this point, let me go to the NTSB thing a little bit, and we're going to scroll down just a few pages here to this Table 1 timeline of events. Okay, as they were coming in, they seemed to sense that something wasn't right. If you come over here, it says during a post-incident interview, the captain stated that as the airplane was getting ready to land, things were not adding up, didn't look good, and so on. That's a little bit of an understatement the way it's worded there. But as they were coming into land, okay, and at only about 300 feet high, Air Canada keys up and says, okay, confirm the runway is clear. And tower says, yeah, you're cleared to land. I don't really fault the tower here for the most part. Again, they're thinking, yeah, the runway is clear. You're still clear to land. Okay. And then somebody else keys up at United 1. Hey, where's that guy going? Okay, he's on the taxiway. Goes right over the airplane. They start to go around. Okay, they come within 16 feet, I believe it is, at 60 feet above the ground with hitting Philippines Flight 115, but they pass over 1, 2, 3, 4 airplanes, almost taking out 4 airplanes plus themselves. And if I go back to Wikipedia for a second, as it's expressed in Wikipedia, again, not that this is determinative, it says a retired pilot stated that the runway confusion that almost happened probably came close to the greatest aviation disaster in history, as 5 airplanes and potentially over 1,000 passengers were at imminent risk. Slight quibble with words. To my mind, 9/11 was the worst aviation disaster ever. The Tenerife collision between the two 747s is, to my mind, the greatest aviation accident in history. To my mind, I think that this would have been the worst aviation accident in history, not disaster. Discussing that is for another day. What I do want to point out, though, is the point that if they had gotten just a few feet lower, and boy, did we dodge the bullet on this one, you potentially had over 1,000 passengers going to die in a fiery conflagration over there on the taxiway next to 28 right. We came that close. Now, this wasn't a problem with the airplane steering and the ability to steer it, except that it kind of was. I mean, here the plane was steering where the pilots were telling it to go. They made a mental problem about where they were, in effect, trying to steer it, and because of that, they potentially put 1,000 people at risk. With that in mind, go pick whatever airport you want and picture that if we're talking about having a plane like a United 232 or like a Delta Flight 1080, and they're coming into some, airliner type airport, we want to think about not only putting them at a place where they're not going to take out the terminal, okay, but we want to put them in a spot where there are no airplanes on the taxiway waiting for takeoff. Every airport will be different. I happen to come here to Denver International. Okay, I'm not familiar off the top of my head with the runway layout, but 3-5 right looks to me, even though it's probably shorter than some of these other ones, to be far better because it's putting nobody else at risk than bringing him into maybe this one here. If you're landing to the west, bringing him into 2-6 is probably a good idea, and so on. This can be repeated elsewhere. Houston, whatever runway this is, 2-6 right. Yes, it has some residential areas that would have to be considered, but I think that's far better than 2-6 left, where maybe, and I can't speak to how Houston runs their operations when they've got airplanes moving and so on, but if you've got planes taxiing out for takeoff here with passengers, and you've got somebody coming in who steers and goes a little bit left, that would be catastrophic. And with hindsight, we would be kicking ourselves for years and years if we do something like that. So, kind of the bottom line takeaway on this is that there are situations where an airplane might have a controllability issue. And I'm kind of, in some sense, more concerned about air carrier airplanes than GA, but the principles apply to both. I think that every large airport should probably put some thought into how they are going to handle an airplane that's coming in with control problems and so on. I'm zooming into Tulsa. It just kind of caught my eye, but I'm not sure where the airport is. There's the airport. So, and at some airports, frankly, it might be that there are no good options, and it might take some decision to go up to whoever, the senior person on duty at the command center. It might have to go up to the FAA administrator or higher and make the unbelievably impossible decision that no, you cannot go to O'Hare with your airplane. You can't steer the thing. We're not letting you go to O'Hare. You may have to go to, I don't know, Rockford or, Springfield or somewhere else, but forget O'Hare. Yeah, there's more hospitals and trauma centers there, but you can't risk people on the ground. So I don't have all the answers on this one, but the next time we ever have an airplane, particularly an air carrier, that's having severe steerability and controllability problems, I want to think about making sure we keep them from terminal areas, keep them from getting near a taxiway where you've got multiple airplanes taxiing and or just sitting there waiting their turn to take off. And instead, we may have to tell a pilot, no, you can't go there, and send them somewhere else that they might otherwise not consider, because we have more things to think about. So thank you for bearing with me in this video, and I hope that we recognize that the Sioux City miracle would have been an O'Hare disaster if they hadn't diverted. Thank you.